On the day of the spring festival in the kingdom of Persia, two strangers arrived at the palace gates. One carried a brass horse that could fly through the air. The other carried a brass peacock that could tell the future. And the king, dazzled by their gifts, made a choice that would cost him his son and nearly cost him his kingdom. Chapter 1. The Festival of Spring. The kingdom of Persia was celebrating. It was the first day of spring, when the snow melted and the rivers ran full, and the whole world seemed to be waking from a long sleep. The king, a wise ruler named Sabah, had thrown open the gates of his palace and invited everyone to feast in the great courtyard. Musicians played, poets recited, the tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats and fresh fruits and sweet pastries. Into this celebration walked two strangers. They came from different directions, but they arrived at the same moment, as if the universe had timed their entrance. The first was an Indian craftsman, old and bent, carrying a brass horse. The second was a Persian philosopher, tall and proud, carrying a brass peacock. They approached the king's throne and bowed. The king looked at their gifts with curiosity. The Indian craftsman spoke first. He said, "My lord, this horse is not an ordinary horse. Wind threw a key in its flank. Mount it, and it will carry you anywhere in the world. It flies faster than any bird. It climbs higher than any cloud. It can take you to the ends of the earth and bring you back before sunset." The king was impressed. He turned to the Persian philosopher, who presented his brass peacock. "My lord," he said, "this peacock is not an ordinary peacock. Turn its tail, and it will tell you the time of day. Turn its head, and it will tell you the weather. Speak a question into its ear, and it will whisper the answer in your own voice." The king was delighted. He offered to pay both men for their gifts. Chapter 2. The Contest of Craftsmanship. The Indian craftsman and the Persian philosopher did not want gold. They wanted the king's favor. They wanted his daughter's hand in marriage. Both of them were in love with the princess, a young woman named Dunya, who was famous throughout the kingdom for her beauty and her intelligence. The king frowned. He could not give both of them his daughter. He could not give her to either of them without offending the other. He decided to test the gifts. He ordered his engineers to examine the brass horse and the brass peacock. The engineers studied them for 3 days. They reported back that both items were genuine. The horse did fly. The peacock did answer questions. The king was torn. The princess, who had heard about the two suitors, came to her father and told him she had no interest in marrying either an old craftsman or a haughty philosopher. She said she would rather marry a poor man she could love than a rich man she could not. The king sighed. He told the two men that they would have to compete for his daughter's hand. The contest was simple. Each man would demonstrate the full capabilities of his invention. The king and his court would judge whose invention was more impressive. The winner would marry the princess. The Indian craftsman demonstrated his horse by flying it around the palace towers 3 times. The Persian philosopher demonstrated his peacock by answering questions that stumped the wisest scholars. The court could not decide. The horse was more spectacular. The peacock was more useful. The princess watched it all and grew more frustrated with every passing moment. Chapter 3. The Prince's Temptation. The king's son, Prince Kamal, had been watching from the shadows. He was young, adventurous, and easily bored by court ceremonies. The brass horse fascinated him. He had never seen anything like it. While the king and the court were distracted by the contest, Prince Kamal crept up to the horse and examined it closely. He found the key in the horse's flank, exactly as the Indian craftsman had described. He turned it. The horse's brass muscles rippled. Its eyes glowed. A low hum came from somewhere inside its metal chest. The prince could not resist. He swung onto the horse's back before anyone could stop him. He turned the key again. The horse lifted off the ground. It hovered, and then it shot upward like an arrow, carrying the prince over the palace walls and into the open sky. The king heard the commotion and looked up. He saw his son disappearing into the clouds, clinging to the back of a brass horse. He screamed for the Indian craftsman. "How do I bring him back?" The craftsman shrugged. "He flies wherever the key takes him," he said. "I cannot control it from here. He will have to find his own way down." The king ordered the craftsman thrown into a dungeon. He sent soldiers into the sky with ropes and ladders, as if they could catch a flying horse. It was useless. Prince Kamal was gone, carried away by a machine that nobody knew how to stop. Chapter 4. The Flight Across the Sky. Prince Kamal was terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. The wind whipped past his face. The ground fell away beneath him until the palace was a speck, and the city was a pattern of tiny squares. He could see the whole kingdom spread out below him like a carpet. He tried to steer the horse. He turned the key one way, and the horse climbed higher. He turned it the other way, and the horse dove toward the ground. He twisted the key, and the horse banked left. He experimented as he flew, learning the controls through trial and error. The horse was remarkably responsive. It was as if it could read his intentions. He flew for hours. He crossed mountains and rivers and deserts. He saw cities he had never heard of. He saw forests that stretched to the horizon. And then, as the sun began to set, he saw something that made him catch his breath. A city of white marble on the shores of a turquoise sea. Towers rose from its center like fingers reaching for the sky. Gardens cascaded down its hillsides. It was the most beautiful place he had ever seen. He guided the horse down toward the city. He landed on the roof of the tallest tower, a building that seemed to be the royal palace. He climbed off the horse and looked around. He was in a kingdom that was not his own, with no idea how to get home. He was lost, and he had never felt more alive. Chapter 5. The Princess of the White City. The palace roof had a door. Prince Kamal opened it and found himself in a hallway lined with guards. The guards drew their swords. The prince raised his hands and said he meant no harm. He was a traveler from the kingdom of Persia. His flying horse had brought him here by accident. The guards did not believe him. They marched him to the throne room of the king of that city. The king was an old man with a kind face, and he listened to Kamal's story with growing interest. "A flying horse," he said. "I have heard of such things in legends. Show me." Kamal led the king to the roof. The brass horse stood where he had left it, gleaming in the last light of the setting sun. The king examined it carefully. He had craftsmen of his own who could study it. He ordered the horse taken to the palace workshop, but the king's daughter, Princess Miriam, was also there. She had followed her father to the roof out of curiosity. She saw the young prince standing beside the horse, dust-covered and exhausted, but with a light in his eyes. She felt something stir in her heart. The prince looked at her and felt the same thing. The king noticed the look between them. He was not opposed to the idea. A prince from a neighboring kingdom was a good match for his daughter, but he needed to know that the prince was who he claimed to be. Chapter 6. The First Night. Prince Kamal was given a room in the palace. It was the finest room he had ever stayed in, with silk curtains and a bed large enough for 4 people. but he could not sleep. He stood at the window and looked out at the city beneath the moonlight. The white marble glowed, the sea glittered, and somewhere in this palace Princess Miriam was lying awake, thinking of him too. The next morning the king summoned Kamal to his court. He asked Kamal about his kingdom, his father, his education. Kamal answered every question with honesty and humility. He could see the king's approval growing, but he also saw something else in the king's eyes: wariness. The king of the White City had been fooled before. He would not be fooled again. The king decided to test Kamal. He gave him a task. There was a garden in the palace that had been cursed by a jinni. Nothing grew there. The soil was black. The water from the fountains tasted like ash. If Kamal could restore the garden, the king would consider his suit for Miriam's hand. Kamal accepted the challenge. He had no idea how to fix a cursed garden, but he knew that failure would mean losing Miriam, and he was not willing to lose her. Chapter 7. The Cursed Garden. Kamal walked through the cursed garden. The air was cold, even though the sun was warm. The soil was black and crumbly, like old charcoal. The trees were bare and twisted. The fountains were dry. A sense of wrongness hung over everything, as if the garden itself was mourning something. He sat down on a broken bench and closed his eyes. He thought about the brass horse. He thought about the key. He thought about the Indian craftsman sitting in his father's dungeon. Somewhere there was an answer. He just had to find it. He remembered something the craftsman had said. The horse was powered by the wind. It stored the wind in its metal body and released it through the key. If the wind could power a horse, could it also power a garden? He had no idea, but he was desperate. He went back to the roof and examined the horse. He found what he was looking for: a small compartment under the saddle containing a pouch of dust that seemed to glow faintly. The craftsman had called it wind dust. It was the essence of the horse's power. Kamal took the pouch and brought it to the garden. He sprinkled the dust over the soil. Nothing happened. He sat down, disappointed, and then the garden began to change. Chapter 8. The Garden Blooms. The change was slow at first. A single blade of green pushed through the black soil, then another, then 100. The grass spread across the ground like a wave. The trees sprouted leaves. The fountains began to flow, at first a trickle, then a steady stream of clear water. The flowers came last: roses, jasmine, lilies, tulips, all blooming at once, filling the garden with color and scent. The cold air warmed. The sense of wrongness lifted, replaced by the simple joy of life returning to a place that had been dead for decades. Princess Miriam was the first to see it. She ran through the palace, shouting for her father. The king came to the window and saw the garden in full bloom. He saw Kamal standing in the middle of it, covered in pollen, grinning like a fool. The king laughed. He had not laughed in years. He summoned Kamal to his throne room and embraced him. The garden had been cursed by a jinni that had haunted the palace for generations. Nobody had been able to break the curse, and a young prince from a faraway kingdom had done it with a pouch of dust and sheer determination. The king gave his blessing for Kamal to marry Miriam. The wedding was set for the next full moon. Chapter 9. The Jealous Plot. Not everyone was happy about the wedding. The king's vizier, a man named Bahram, had wanted Miriam for his own son. He had spent years positioning his family for the throne. A foreign prince appearing out of nowhere and winning the princess's heart had ruined everything. Bahram decided to destroy Kamal. He went to the palace workshop where the brass horse was being studied. He bribed the guards. He stole the horse. He loaded it onto a cart and took it to a secret location outside the city walls. If the prince could not fly home, he could not marry the princess. He would be stuck in the White City forever, dependent on the king's goodwill, and Bahram could slowly poison the king's mind against him. But Kamal had noticed something that Bahram had not. The horse was not the only way to fly. Kamal had been studying the horse's design. He understood how it worked. He had been building a second horse in secret, using materials from the palace workshop. It was smaller and cruder than the original, but it worked. He tested it in the cursed garden at midnight, flying low and slow to avoid detection. When he discovered that the original horse was missing, he was not worried. He had a backup plan, and he had something more important than the horse. He had Miriam's love. Chapter 10. The Vizier's Downfall. The night before the wedding, Bahram made his move. He went to the king and told him that Kamal was not a prince at all. He was a spy sent by a rival kingdom. The flying horse was a weapon. The restoration of the garden was a trick. Everything Kamal had done was part of a plot to take the throne. The king listened. He was old and tired and suspicious by nature. He ordered Kamal arrested and thrown into the dungeon. Miriam begged her father to reconsider. The king refused. In the dungeon, Kamal sat in the darkness and thought about his situation. He was alone. He was imprisoned. The woman he loved was on the other side of stone walls, and a lying vizier was about to destroy everything. He called for the guards. He told them he could prove his innocence. He asked to be taken to the palace roof. The guards, who had grown fond of him, agreed. On the roof, Kamal mounted his smaller flying horse. He flew to the vizier's secret location and retrieved the original horse. He brought both horses back to the palace and landed in the courtyard in front of the king. He challenged Bahram to ride the original horse. If the vizier could fly it as well as Kamal had, then Kamal would accept that he was not the rightful owner. If he could not, then Bahram's plot would be exposed. Bahram had no choice. He mounted the horse. He turned the key. The horse lifted off. And then it went wild, spinning and twisting, throwing Bahram into the palace fountain. The vizier was humiliated. His plot was exposed. Chapter 11. The Wedding. The king apologized to Kamal. He banished Bahram from the kingdom, and he gave his blessing for the wedding to proceed, not just with joy, but with relief. He had almost made a terrible mistake. The wedding was the grandest the White City had ever seen. The streets were decorated with flowers and lanterns. Musicians played in every square. The feast lasted for 7 days. Kamal and Miriam were married under a canopy of silk and stars, surrounded by people who had come to love the foreign prince who had restored their garden and defeated their wicked vizier. But Kamal knew he could not stay forever. His father, the king of Persia, did not know where he was. His mother would be worried sick. The kingdom of Persia was waiting for its prince to come home. Miriam understood. She agreed to return with him to Persia. She kissed her father goodbye and promised to visit often. The old king wept. He had just found his daughter's happiness, and now she was leaving. Kamal and Miriam mounted the brass horse together. Kamal turned the key. The horse lifted off, carrying them over the White City, over the turquoise sea, over the mountains and deserts, toward the kingdom of Persia. Chapter 12. The Homecoming. Prince Kamal and Princess Miriam flew over the mountains of Persia as the sun was rising. The land below them was green and familiar. Kamal's heart swelled with joy. He was coming home, and he was bringing a wife. They landed in the courtyard of the palace. The guards recognized the horse and ran to alert the king. King Sabah came running out of the throne room, his robes flapping behind him. He had not slept in weeks. He had not eaten. He had been consumed by grief over his lost son. When he saw Kamal alive and well, with a beautiful woman at his side, he wept. He embraced his son and held him for a long time. Then he ordered the Indian craftsman released from the dungeon. He had the craftsman brought before him and told him that his invention, which had nearly cost the kingdom its prince, had also brought the prince a wife. He pardoned the craftsman and sent him home with a bag of gold. Kamal introduced Miriam to his father. The king was charmed by her grace and intelligence. A second wedding was held in Persia, as grand as the first. The two kingdoms, Persia and the White City, became allies. Trade flourished. Ambassadors travelled between them. The brass horse was placed in the royal treasury, where it stood as a reminder of the day a young prince stole a magical invention and found his destiny on the other side of the sky. And on quiet nights, when the moon was full, Kamal would take Miriam to the roof of the palace. They would sit together and look at the stars, remembering the day a flying horse had brought them together. The end.